Ron Howard, the child star who grew into one of the most respected filmmakers in Hollywood, has always carried himself as the industry's good guy, a steady hand, a soft-spoken visionary, a man who never let himself get pulled into the tabloid storms of gossip and scandal. But now, at this late point in his career, Ron Howard has broken his silence, and what he has revealed has left fans stunned, because for the first time, he has peeled back the curtain on one of the most legendary names in Hollywood, Harrison Ford. And what he admits is not flattering at all. In fact, it may forever change the way audiences see the man who brought Han Solo and Indiana Jones to life, because Ron Howard, after decades of silence, has confessed that Ford's rise to superstardom came with arrogance, ego, and a difficult personality that left wounds across sets, friendships, and collaborations, including Howard's own. Their story begins in the early 1970s with American Graffiti, the George Lucas cult classic where Howard played the clean-cut Steve Bolander while Harrison Ford, still a carpenter trying to break into acting, landed the small but unforgettable role of Bob Falfa, the cocky drag racer who oozed charisma. And while audiences adored the film, behind the scenes things were not as smooth, because Howard recalls Ford constantly questioning direction, mocking the cheesier lines, and acting as though he were above the material, a trait that didn't sit well with Lucas, who was struggling to hold the low-budget film together, yet tolerated Ford's behavior because he knew the man had something special on screen. But Howard, even then, saw through the bravado, seeing in Ford not just confidence but a sharp arrogance that belittled others, including himself, a young actor trying to transition from child star to serious adult roles. And though Ford's sneering comments, including one that dismissed Howard as safe and boring, cut deep, Howard remained professional, swallowing the sting while quietly resolving that he would never treat colleagues that way. When Ford's career exploded just a few years later with Star Wars, Howard was among those who congratulated him. But now he reveals that the man behind the galactic hero wasn't always as heroic, because Ford's difficult nature began to show on set after set, with whispered stories of clashes with Ridley Scott during Blade Runner, tension with George Lucas and Mark Hamill during Star Wars, and even conflicts with Steven Spielberg during Indiana Jones. And though Hollywood's unwritten code kept many quiet, Howard admits he saw enough both during American Graffiti and in later interactions to know that Ford's on-screen charm often hid an off-screen personality that was far harder to admire. He remembers industry dinners where Ford dominated the conversation, cutting people off and making snide jokes at their expense, including one evening where he mocked Howard's directing career just as he was beginning to find his footing, joking that Opie should stick to TV. A jab that Howard laughed off publicly but never forgot, because it reflected the same dismissiveness he had seen years earlier, a pattern that followed Ford as his fame grew. Even later, when Howard became an Oscar-winning director, the tension remained, with Ford reluctant to work under him, allegedly turning down opportunities to collaborate because he didn't want to be directed by Richie Cunningham. A remark Howard now acknowledges stung deeply but also revealed the insecurity behind Ford's tough exterior. And while fans worship Ford for his rugged roles, Howard is finally telling the truth. That the legend was built on more than talent, it was also built on a Hollywood system that tolerated arrogance because box office numbers mattered more than kindness or humility. And in breaking this silence, Howard admits that his avoidance of projects involving Ford was not coincidence but choice, because he simply refused to subject his cast and crew to the volatility he had once endured. He even recalls an incident years later at a studio event where Ford, clearly irritated with a question, snapped at a young assistant in a way that left the room silent, and though Howard tried to diffuse the tension, the moment stayed with him as another example of how the myth of Harrison Ford differed so drastically from the man himself. And now, at 70, Howard feels liberated to say what he once couldn't. That while Harrison Ford's contributions to cinema are undeniable, his off-screen reputation is far more complicated, marked by clashes, arrogance, and behavior that alienated colleagues, himself included. And though Howard insists he holds no bitterness, he admits the truth must finally be told, because silence only protects illusions, and illusions are what Hollywood has always thrived on. And so this revelation, coming from a man who rarely speaks ill of anyone, lands like a thunderclap, because if Ron Howard, the ultimate diplomat of Hollywood, is willing to say Harrison Ford was difficult, dismissive, and sometimes cruel, then perhaps the legend we've worshipped for decades is far darker than we ever imagined, and maybe the price of stardom, in Ford's case, was not just his own soul but the relationships he scorched along the way, leaving behind a legacy that is brilliant on film but fractured in reality. A legacy that Ron Howard, with his quiet voice finally rising, has now dared to expose for the world to see.